It was a hot summer day in northern Mesopotamia. The clamoring of tools echoed between the slopes of a narrow valley in front of the walls of Dara, as engineers shouted orders, knowing that the battlements must be finished before dark. From a hilltop overlooking the city, Flavius Belisarius was conducting these hasty defensive preparations, aware that he will soon have to confront a much larger army that had just crossed the border into Roman territory. The Persians are coming. It has been 25 years since the last vestiges of the Western Roman Empire crumbled, with its imperial legacy and tradition passing on to the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. The overall ambition of early Byzantine emperors was to restore the old Roman Empire, but in the early 6th century, the country's geopolitics would be shaped mainly in relation to their perennial enemy in the east, the powerful Sasanian Empire. After the Anastasian War, peace lasted for nearly 20 years, but after centuries of repeated long and costly wars, mutual distrust persisted between the two superpowers, and preparations for the next looming conflict began as soon as the previous war ended. The Byzantine Empire didn't have the military power and resources of the old Roman Empire, but was very formidable defensively. In contrast, the Sasanians dominated pitched battles with their superior cavalry, but lacked the shock infantry, siege equipment, and specialists to break through the chain of Byzantine fortifications into the Anatolian interior. From Constantinople, two capable rulers oversaw a continued economic and political strengthening of the empire during this period. Anastasius I heeded the advice of his generals and strengthened the porous eastern border. Here, on the flat plain between the deserts in the south and the mountains in the north, Byzantine armies fared badly during the Anastasian War, due to the lack of a major base in the area that would serve as a rallying point for offensive and defensive operations. This meant that the troops had to march long distances from strongholds further west in order to reach the border. In contrast, the Sasanians used the fortified city of Nisibis, a former Roman stronghold that was ceded to Persia nearly 2 centuries prior, to launch attacks deep into Byzantine territory, and then return to the safety of the city walls to gather their strength and resupply. To counter this, the emperor ordered the building of a heavily fortified city of Dara. Masons and workers gathered from across Mesopotamia worked with great haste to complete the 20-meter-high walls, 3-story towers, the citadel, large storehouses and barracks, a public bath and water systems, along with a canal that diverted a local river to ensure the city had ample water supply. Dara would be a refuge for Byzantine armies, where the troops could rest, prepare their weapons, and guard the entrance into Syria. But Anastasius's domestic policies were perhaps of greater significance. He improved the empire's monetary system and issued a new form of currency in gold, silver, and, more importantly, copper coins, finally ending the inflation that prevailed for almost 200 years since the times of Constantine the Great, thereby greatly enriching the lower classes who were the ones that mostly used copper coins in their daily lives and business. The tax code was reformed to close loopholes exploited by the rich, and tax-collecting responsibilities were taken from powerful local senators and assigned to select agents of the Praetorian prefect. He stimulated trade and industry by lowering taxes paid by the urban classes, and greatly curbed reckless government spending and corruption. By the time of his death in 518, Anastasius's focus on fiscal policies stabilized and vastly enriched the country internally, increasing the imperial treasury and leaving a sizable budget surplus. Justin I, who was in his late 60s when he took power, continued the consolidation of the empire. He kept Anastasius's economic policies, further enriching the treasury, and resumed the commitment of maintaining armies in the east. On the diplomatic front, he secretly cultivated client states on the borders of the empire, trying to gain an advantage over Persia by creating buffer zones and staging points for possible future proxy wars. In Arabia, Justin supported the successful Axumian invasion of the Himyarites, in effect wresting control of this strategically important kingdom from the Sasanians, gaining access to valuable trade routes for frankincense and myrrh. To the north, the Byzantine emperor meddled in the predominantly Christian Iberia, encouraging various influential bishops to start an insurrection against the Sasanians. In addition, he fostered Byzantine influence over the kingdom of Lazica by personally awarding its king the insignia and robes of kingship, and arranged for him to marry a Byzantine noblewoman, all of which increased the king's legitimacy in the eyes of the local nobility. In exchange, Justin demanded the king's conversion to Christianity and the stationing of Byzantine garrisons in Lazica, aiming to reduce Sasanian influence. But while Justin quietly formed these alliances, he continued the rational policy of paying subsidies to Persia in exchange for peace, for this was cheaper than funding expensive wars. Instrumental in enforcing these subsidies was the formidable Sasanian king of kings, Kawad I. He impressed upon the Byzantines that an invasion from the east by the Hephthalites, sometimes called the White Huns, posed a grave danger to Persia, and, if not stopped, it would be only a matter of time before they reached Byzantine lands. Kawad exploited the fact that the memories of the Hunnic invasions in Europe were still fresh, successfully persuading Constantinople to pay the Sasanians for keeping the Hephthalites in check, warning that if payments weren't forthcoming, Persian armies would raid Byzantine lands and use the plunder to fund the struggle against the nomads in the east. This bit of shrewd diplomacy was a show of brilliance Kawad often displayed throughout his reign. Despite inheriting a declining empire, he reorganized the state, laying the foundation for Iranians to re-establish themselves as a superpower by introducing many political, economic, social, and military reforms that restored the empire's territories in the east and curbed the power and corruption of the nobility and clergy, and he used Persia's position along the major trade routes to exert pressure on the Byzantines, effectively establishing a trading monopoly in the region. But the implementation of his reforms inevitably took time, and would only be fully completed by his son and successor, Khosrow I. Kawad correctly saw potential in his young son, and greatly preferred him over his other sons. But Khosrow was just 12 years old, and the priority of the Persian king was to secure the boy's succession, aware that his position and life were threatened by his 3 older sons, each of whom was backed by powerful noble factions. To protect the young prince, Kawad approached Justin, asking him to formally adopt Khosrow. The Byzantine emperor was open to the idea, but being childless himself, he was aware that an adopted Sasanian prince would have a claim on the throne in Constantinople, and he offered adoption according to barbarian custom. This deeply offended Kawad. With the breakdown of negotiations, a series of proxy wars ignited. To the south, the Byzantines now openly supported the Axumites, providing ships that would transport troops to Yemen, seeking to expand Christian influence and access the spice and silk trade routes to India. In northern Arabia, Lakhmids raided Byzantine territories on the edge of the desert, supported by the Persians. In Iberia, Kawad sent troops to crush the religious insurrection and force the Christian population to convert to Zoroastrianism. The Iberian king fled to Lazica and soon received support from Justin, who recruited Huns from the north of the Caucasus to assist the Iberians. The Sasanians attempted to regain control over Lazica, but were beaten back by Byzantine troops stationed there. By now, Justin was an old man, and he ceded control of the empire to his capable nephew, Justinian I, who officially ascended the throne a few months later after Justin had died. With the onset of Justinian's reign, open conflict broke out in the Trans-Caucasus region and northern Mesopotamia, with the Persians maintaining the initiative. In 527, the revolt in Iberia had been crushed, and a Byzantine offensive on Nisibis and Thebatha was defeated, while Persian attacks prevented the Byzantines from fortifying Thanarus and Melabassa, another two key points along the border. A year later, Sasanian armies again tried to press into Lazica, this time capturing several fortresses in the eastern part of the kingdom. Hard-pressed along the entire border, Justinian tried to remedy the situation by dividing the command in the east, with Sitas placed in charge of the northern front in Armenia, and Belisarius spearheaded the important expedition on the southern front to protect the construction of a border fort at Thanarus. But his forces were defeated by Xerxes, one of Coad's sons, and he had to retreat back to Dara. The Sasanians, however, suffered heavy losses, with 500 immortals falling in battle. This enraged Coad, who stripped Xerxes of command and imprisoned him. In 529, further Lakhmidian raids devastated parts of Syria, which prompted Justinian to strengthen his own Arab allies, assisting the loose coalition of Ghassanid tribes to form a coherent kingdom that would put pressure on the Lakhmids. With the Byzantines on the back foot, Coad tasked his main army in the south to march on Dara, aiming to deal a killing blow to Justinian's forces in Syria. A day after leaving Nisibis, the Sasanian army reached the outskirts of Dara. Observing the Byzantine battle order, it was obvious to Firuz that his army was the superior one. But, seeing that Belisarius took up position in a narrow gap, he knew that he would either have to force the Byzantines back into the city and besiege them, or draw them out into the open. Firuz had 40,000 troops under his command. Some 15,000 infantry were made up of levied troops of poor training and little fighting ability, while another 5,000 were heavy infantry mercenaries, similar to the old Roman legionnaires. His 20,000 heavy cavalry in lamella armor fought as cataphracts, possessing the ability to shoot from horseback and deal some of the most devastating frontal charges of their time. Lined up across the field, Belisarius rejected the idea of being besieged inside the walls of Dara and made preparations for a pitched battle in front of the city. However, he faced two major problems. With 25,000 men at his disposal, he was significantly outnumbered, and most of his troops were inferior to their Persian counterparts. 15,000 cavalry was his main force, divided between the two wings. Although experienced, most were outclassed by the Persian cataphracts, with his only crack-mounted units being the 1,200 Huns in the inclined center and the 1,500 Buchalari serving as his most trusted personal elite regiment of mounted retainers, held in reserve. His infantry numbered 10,000 troops and were generally of poor quality, composed of frontier garrison troops, provincial forces, survivors from prior battles, and men that were hastily recruited from the countryside, some of whom had to be given basic archery training in the days before the battle to compensate for the low number of archers. Morale of the infantry was low due to continuous setbacks and defeats suffered against the Persians along the entire front, and Belisarius knew that if they were faced with a full-blown Sasanian cavalry charge, they would not hold for long. To offset his army's deficiencies, the Byzantine commander had a long line of ditches dug along the entire line. The ditch was too wide for cavalry to jump over, designed to slow down the charge of the dangerous Persian cavalry, and multiple narrow crossings were created to serve as choke points. The infantry trench was positioned further back to protect the unreliable footmen, where they could be supported by missile troops stationed on the city walls. With the Byzantines firmly entrenched, it was up to the Sasanians to make the first move. Most of the day passed with no action, but towards the late afternoon, elements of the Persian right wing advanced towards the enemy at a steady pace. It is unclear if the cavalry officers wanted to test the resolve of what they perceived to be an inferior foe, or if Firuz gave the order for a probing attack, but the charging cavalry soon closed in. After a short clash, Belisarius' cavalry fell back, with the Persians in hot pursuit. Then came the signal for the archers. Soon after, the Byzantines wheeled about to face the pursuers. Caught by a feigned retreat and counterattack, the Sasanians retreated back to their own lines, trying in turn to lure the Byzantines into giving chase. But Belisarius kept his men from going beyond the trenches. Realizing that he will have to grind down the enemy, Firuz sent word to request reinforcements. Seeking to galvanize the troops, a Persian champion marched out from the line, challenging anyone in the Byzantine army to single combat. A young man by the name of Andreas, who was an attendant of one of the Byzantine officers and had been training with Belisarius' bodyguards, accepted the challenge. In several seconds the duel was over, with Andreas walking back to his position to the cheers of the troops. But halfway back to his line, a second Persian stepped forward. Unbidden, Andreas again obliged the challenger. Not long after, the fight was over. Winning in single combat for a second time, Andreas returned to his line a hero. By next morning, Firuz's reinforcements arrived from Nisibis. Much of the second day of the battle passed in negotiations between the two commanders. It seemed that both were trying to reach a peaceful resolution, although it is quite possible that Firuz was trying to buy time until all of his reinforcements arrived. As the day progressed, it became apparent that the flowery language of diplomacy will accomplish nothing. Finally, Firuz wrote to Belisarius, telling him to prepare a bath for him in Dara, so he could relax after his coming victory. Negotiations were over. By the third day, Firuz received 10,000 reinforcements, including several thousand of the feared immortals, bringing his force up to 50,000, a 2-to-1 numerical advantage over the Byzantines. Emboldened, he resolved to attack. His plan was to utilize his superior cavalry to overwhelm the Byzantine flanks and then double envelop the static center. Suspecting that Belisarius would strengthen his left flank after yesterday's skirmishing, Firuz sent the Immortals to join the attack on the now weakened Byzantine right flank. Archers moved forward, with orders to keep the opposing projectile troops occupied during the cavalry charge. Persian infantry remained largely static, but moved slightly up the field, lagging behind the archers. When the two lines came into range of one another, the battle began with a heavy exchange of projectiles. The Persians maintained a heavier volume of projectiles, but a strong wind blew against them, largely negating their superiority in archery. Firuz ordered his cavalry not to charge at full gallop, but to approach the enemy at a steady pace, knowing that the trenches will break up the momentum of the attack. As the wall of armored cavalry methodically approached the trenches, Byzantine troops stood with bated breath. Looking to his left, Belisarius could see the frantic struggle. Riders impaled on spears and struck down from their horses, as the Persians advanced in full force. Pressed too heavily, the Byzantines could not disengage, and they were slowly being pushed back. Meanwhile, the main Sasanian assault on Belisarius' right broke through several sections of the trench. Firuz's reserves, the elite mounted immortals, with their riders and horses clad in armor, were grinding down everything in front of them. Seeing that his right is hard-pressed, Belisarius sent the Huns from his center-right to charge the Persian inner flank, hoping to slow down their advance. On the left, however, was where the Byzantine commander set a trap for the Persians. He signaled a contingent of several hundred cavalry, until now hidden in the trees on the hillside, to charge the Sasanians, and sent the Huns from his center-left to attack from the other side. The reason Belisarius set an ambush on his left was that he thought that the main Persian thrust would come there. But now, with his other flank collapsing, he hurriedly turned and led his own elite reserves to aid the troops on the right, who were by now in a fight for their life. Having suffered heavy losses, some of the contingents held their ground, while others were near breaking point. Desperate to get there in time, Belisarius galloped straight for the Persian inner flank. The momentum of the charge split through the enemy line, with some of the Sasanian contingents in the front continuing to hack their way forward, while those further back were now interlocked with Belisarius' retinue. Across the field, Firuz's attack was now dead in its tracks. With his forces on the Byzantine left almost entirely surrounded, communications were severely impacted and the chain of command was collapsing. Sasanian officers found it increasingly difficult to control the men. Before long, panic set in, and the Persian right flank fled in disarray, leaving some 3,000 dead on the field. Some of the Byzantine units turned to help the other flank, so the pursuit of the retreating horsemen was brief, as the Byzantines stuck to their commander's plan to keep the position on the edge of the trenches. On the right, Belisarius' flanking attack finally stopped the Persian heavy cavalry juggernaut. During the bitter struggle, the Persian second-in-command was struck down, together with his standard-bearer, causing the Sasanians to quickly lose heart. Many could not break out and were slaughtered then and there, while others managed to find their way back to the main line. Belisarius again restricted his troops from pursuing the enemy. Despite achieving a stunning victory, he knew that the Persians still outnumbered his army, thus it would have likely been a bloody fight to get into the Sasanian camp to loot it. Byzantine casualties weren't recorded, but could not have been much less than 5,000 dead or wounded. The Persians, on the other hand, suffered up to 10,000 casualties. In spite of being outnumbered 2-1, Belisarius' tactical masterclass secured one of the rare victories in a pitched battle for the Byzantines against the Sasanians in recent years. But the war went on. Although Justinian's two commanders in the east achieved brilliant tactical victories at Dara and Satala against vastly superior Persian armies, a year later, Kawad mounted further offensives, defeating Belisarius at Callinicum and laying siege to Mesopotamia. Justinian attempted to offer terms, which Kawad rejected. It seemed like the end of the war was nowhere in sight. But then, in 532, Kawad I died, and Justinian's envoys reopened negotiations with the new Sasanian king of kings, Khosrow I. With the new Persian ruler needing to secure his position on the throne, the two sides signed a peace treaty, under which all occupied territories were returned, and Justinian agreed to pay 11,000 pounds of gold. As for Flavius Belisarius, despite his defeat at Callinicum, he remained one of the ablest generals in the empire, and in the years to come, he will spearhead Justinian's ambitious military campaigns to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.